I moved into the house on Vallejo Street on a Friday in September, which I know for certain because I have the lift receipt on my phone. $34.50 from the Airbnb I'd been staying in for 3 weeks, marked 11:42 a.m. I remember thinking it was a good omen, arriving before noon. I like to start things in the morning. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that I am a specific traceable person with a phone and a bank account and a sister in Redwood City who texts me every Sunday without fail. I had places to be and people who would notice if I wasn't in them. I want you to know that before I tell you what happened, because the thing about what happened is that none of it should have been possible. And yet. The landlady's name was Constance. She was somewhere in her late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of woman who always seemed to have just made tea. The house was a 3-story Victorian on the slope of Pacific Heights, the kind of place that rents rooms to young professionals at prices that should embarrass everyone involved. And I had found it the way I found everything that year, on my phone, at midnight, slightly desperate. She showed me the room on the 2nd floor, and I said yes before she'd finished talking. High ceilings, a window that looked out over the bay, a window seat worn soft with use. After 7 months of studio apartments with shared walls and fluorescent lighting, it felt like a place where a person could actually breathe. There were a few ground rules, she said. Over tea that first afternoon, no smoking inside, guests needed notice, and the 3rd floor was closed off. She gestured upward in a way that suggested inconvenience rather than mystery. Renovation work, structural concerns, her contractor was taking forever. I nodded. I wasn't interested in the 3rd floor. I was interested in the window seat and the bay view, and finally unpacking my suitcase, somewhere I might stay for more than 4 months. The first strange thing was small enough to explain away. About 6 weeks in, I found a grocery receipt in the pocket of my rain jacket. Not a list, an actual receipt time-stamped and itemized from the Safeway on Marina Boulevard. The date was October 3rd. I hadn't moved in until October 9th. I stared at it for a while, turning it over. Then I told myself what people tell themselves. I must have worn the jacket before the move. I must have been in the neighborhood scoping things out. I must have grabbed coffee nearby and stopped in. I put it in the recycling and didn't think about it for 2 more weeks. What I thought about instead was Constance's cooking. She left things outside my door sometimes. Soup, bread, a slice of something on a plate. And I ate them because I was tired and grateful, and the food was genuinely extraordinary. What I noticed later, much later, was the pattern. I always slept deeply after those meals. Not pleasantly deeply, the way you do after a long day, but heavily, the way you do when your body has been instructed to shut down. I would eat at 8 and wake at noon, or eat at 7 and not open my eyes until the following morning, with the particular grogginess of having missed something I couldn't account for. I told myself it was the new environment. I told myself I was finally decompressing. I was wrong about both. The neighbor thing I couldn't rationalize as easily. A man who walked his dog on the block every morning nodded at me one day and said he was glad I was looking better. I laughed politely and said I hadn't been ill. He gave me the kind of look people give when they've been asked to stay out of something. Not confused, just careful, and moved on with his dog. I brought it up to Constance that evening. She had a gentle, perfectly reasonable explanation. I'd apparently lived on this block before, briefly, with a roommate, several years ago, and some of the older residents had seen me move out and assumed I'd gone through something. She even remembered the roommate's name. I didn't. But that wasn't unusual. I'd had several over the years. I sat with her explanation and found the edges and decided it fit well enough. My sister called on a Sunday in November and asked if I was okay. I said yes. Why? She said I'd sounded strange the last couple weeks. A little vague, not quite like myself. I said I was tired from a new project at work. She said I'd mentioned the same project the previous Sunday and hadn't remembered mentioning it. I made a joke about brain fog, and she let it go. The way you let things go with someone you love when you can't figure out what you're actually worried about. After I hung up, I sat on the window seat and looked at the bay for a long time. I opened my phone and scrolled back through our text history, and there were gaps in my end of the conversation, stretches of 3 or 4 days, where I apparently hadn't responded and then had replied as though no time had passed. I had no memory of the days in question. Not hazy memory, no memory at all. I started keeping notes in my phone, just small things: what I ate, where I went, what I did, documentation, insurance against whatever was happening to my continuity. And that was when I noticed that the notes I was writing already existed. Earlier versions in the same app, with earlier dates, recording the same observations about the house, the same unease about the gaps, written as though for the first time. I had apparently been here before. Not 4 years, not anything dramatic. 7 weeks. 7 weeks of loop, of the same slow accumulation of suspicion, reset and begun again. When I was looking at my own breadcrumb trail, left by a version of myself who had gotten this far and then lost the thread. I did not sit on the bed and think carefully. I did not wait until nightfall. I screenshotted everything. The notes, the text gaps, the receipt photo I'd been smart enough to take before throwing it away, and sent it all to my sister with a message that said only, "I think something is wrong at this house. If I don't call you in 2 hours, come to this address." Then I put on my shoes and my jacket, and I walked out of the room and down the stairs and toward the front door, because Constance was out and the house was empty, and it was 2 in the afternoon, and there was no reason to wait for dark or drama. She was at the bottom of the stairs. I don't know how. I'd heard the front door close 20 minutes earlier. She was standing in the hallway between me and the exit, and her expression was not threatening. That was the worst part. She looked the way she always looked. Warm, attentive, slightly sad, the way someone looks when a difficult thing must be done for someone else's own good. She said my name in a tone that implied I wasn't well, that I'd been confusing things again, that this was a pattern with me and she was so sorry I was frightened. She held out her hand. In it was a small ceramic cup of tea, still steaming. I threw it. I'm not proud of the specifics, but I threw the cup and I pushed past her, and I ran the last 8 steps to the door, and I got it open, and I got through it, and I kept running until I reached the corner and flagged down a stranger and asked them to call 911 because my hands were shaking too badly to unlock my phone. My sister arrived before the police did. I was sitting on a neighbor's front step with my arms around my knees and my eyes on the door of the house on Vallejo Street, watching it, waiting for it to open. It didn't open. Constance was gone when the officers went inside. The 3rd floor was unlocked. The room up there was exactly what I had somehow known it would be. Not full of orchids, but full of documentation. Folders, handwritten schedules, amber prescription bottles with no labels, pharmaceutical grade, contents unidentified pending lab analysis, and photographs, mine, yes, but also others. 4 other women, each with her own folder, each spanning somewhere between 5 and 12 weeks. I was the most recent. I was also, the detective told me quietly while we sat in his car, the first one to get out on her own. I don't know how long Constance had been doing it, or where she went, or what exactly was in the bottles. The lab results took 3 months. My sister flew up that same evening and sat with me in the Redwood City apartment I moved into the next morning, and she asked me to walk her through it from the beginning. And I did. I told her everything. At the end, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "But you kept sending me those Sunday texts. You never missed a Sunday." And I looked at her, and I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that I had found texts in my phone that I didn't remember writing, sent on days I couldn't account for, and they'd all been perfectly normal. Someone had been sending them. They had been very careful. They had been doing this for a long time. I didn't say it because there was nothing useful in saying it that night. Instead, I asked her to make tea, and then, before she could, I got up and made it myself. The morning Reyes handed me the printout, he had already spilled coffee on it. I mention this because it matters to me. The brown ring in the upper left corner of a document showing an impossible depth reading. Because Reyes was so unsettled, he'd forgotten he was holding a mug. That's the detail I keep coming back to, not the number. The coffee stain. I had been on the Ines Falk for 31 days when the anomaly appeared. We were 40 miles northwest of Fort Bragg doing a standard bathymetric pass, mapping the Northern California shelf, which I had surveyed twice before and which was, in the vocabulary of oceanographic fieldwork, deeply boring. 180 to 220 meters of depth, consistent sediment columns, a geology that had not changed in any meaningful way since the last glacial maximum. I had a paper due in January, and I was using the survey downtime to draft sections of it on a laptop that kept overheating. I was annoyed about the laptop. I was not thinking about anything unusual. The sonar returned 3,400 meters. Reyes recalibrated, ran a diagnostic, recalibrated again, came to find me, handed me the printout without saying anything, which is how I knew it was serious because Reyes talked constantly. Sports, his daughter's school, the specific injustices of the vessel's coffee rotation. His silence was its own data point. We ran the pass 4 more times. The number didn't change. There was a trench beneath us that had not been there in April, that registered on no seismic record, that had formed without any of the geological preconditions that make trench formation possible on a continental shelf. My colleague Drummond, who studies deep-sea acoustics and who had spent the better part of our first week aboard explaining to anyone within earshot why the ocean was functionally an alien planet, said nothing when I showed him the readings. He looked at them for a long time, and then he went and sat on the deck by himself for 20 minutes, which was the longest I had ever seen Drummond go without making a sound. We deployed a probe, standard tethered submersible, rated to 4,000 meters, camera and hydrophone and collection arm. The descent was unremarkable for the first 1,000 meters. Cold water, marine snow, bioluminescence, in the middle distance, the ordinary dark. Around 1,400 meters, the video feed began degrading. Not a clean signal loss. More like watching a television through several layers of wet gauze. Shapes still visible, and edges dissolving, colors bleeding into each other in ways that didn't correspond to any interference pattern I recognized. By 1,800 meters, we couldn't make out anything definitive. Drummond kept saying he thought he could see structure in the feed, repeating it quietly to himself, and eventually I asked him to stop. The hydrophone worked perfectly. That was the thing. Crystal clear audio from a depth where the video was essentially gone, capturing a rhythm that had no business being there. Regular pulses, grouped, varying, not random. Drummond pulled the spectrogram and looked at it for a long time and then said very quietly that it was sequential. Not cyclical, not random, not the pressure groans of geology. Sequential. He meant it was progressing. He meant it was going somewhere, building toward something. Knew the way a sentence builds toward a period. He did not say what he thought the period would sound like. He closed the spectrogram and didn't bring it up again that night. We retrieved the probe at 2,100 meters when the tether tension started behaving inconsistently, pulling in a direction that wasn't straight down, which shouldn't have been possible at that depth in those conditions. The probe came up intact. In its collection basket was an organism I could not classify. Roughly palm-sized, translucent, no hard structures, no feature I could immediately identify as a sensory apparatus. It cycled through opacities when we brought it under the lab lights. Clear to milky to clear again, in a rhythm Drummond immediately recognized as matching the hydrophone pulses exactly. He went very still when he realized it. He made a sound I'd never heard from him before, a kind of soft exhale like someone who has just confirmed something they were hoping was wrong. I put a fiber optic light source near it. It responded, not by moving. It had no apparent musculature, but by reorganizing something internal, some arrangement of its own tissue. And the result, when viewed from a particular angle, was a configuration of shadows that my brain processed as a face. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I am not saying it had a face. I am saying that the arrangement of translucent material, backlit by the fiber optic, produced something my visual cortex interpreted as a face, which is a cognitive phenomenon with a name, pareidolia. And Drummond said the word twice, and neither of us looked at it directly after that. On that night, the first mate found one of the crew at the stern rail, fully clothed, looking down at the water. He was not in distress. He was talking very quietly, too quietly to make out. He had no memory when she brought him inside of having left his bunk. 2 nights later, 2 more crew members, same location, same posture, same absence of memory afterward. I set an alarm for 1:50 a.m. on the 3rd night and sat in a deck chair at the stern to wait. Here is what actually happened, which I have tried to describe accurately in 3 separate written statements, and which keeps coming out wrong. At some point between 1:50 and 2:15 a.m., I was standing at the rail. There was no transition I can account for. I was in the chair, and then I was at the rail with my hands on the cold metal, and the water below me was not reflecting anything because there was no moon, and it was simply dark. I was not frightened. I want to be specific about this because the absence of fear was itself frightening in retrospect. I was standing at the stern rail of a research vessel at 2 in the morning, having lost 25 minutes, and I felt nothing except a kind of focused attention directed downward, as though I was waiting for something I had already agreed to see. I stepped back. I went inside. I sat in the wet lab with every light on until the sun came up, and I didn't write anything in my log because I didn't know what to write that wouldn't make me sound like someone who should be removed from the vessel. I transmitted the data at 0600, the sonar records, and the spectrogram, the probe footage up to degradation, the organism photographs and tissue samples. I told the captain we needed to leave. We pulled anchor at 0800 and ran southwest at full cruise speed. We did not talk about the fact that at 1400 hours, we were back at the trench coordinates. The GPS was functioning. The engines were functioning. We had traveled for 6 hours in a straight line and arrived at the point we'd left. The captain tried again, same heading. We ran for 4 more hours and ended up in the same place. On the 3rd attempt, she altered course significantly, took us on a wide arc that added hours to the transit, and we made headway, fighting a current that our instruments said wasn't there, and at a speed that made no sense given our fuel consumption. And by the following morning, we were in water that read 190 meters depth, and the captain filed an equipment malfunction report that neither of us believed. The organism died on day 4. It didn't decompose. It became less substantial, which is not a scientific description, and I am aware of that. One morning, the collection jar held water and a residue that looked like the iridescent film on a soap bubble and smelled like the air before a lightning strike. Sharp, metallic, briefly electric. That specific detail I have not included in any of my official reports because I cannot figure out how to write it in a way that belongs in a report. The lab results came back 6 weeks later. The tissue samples were flagged by 2 separate university labs as either contaminated or anomalous, and neither lab wanted to elaborate. One researcher I spoke to on the phone said he'd referred the samples to a colleague who specialized in extremophile biology, and that the colleague had asked where exactly we'd retrieved them. When I told him, he was quiet for a moment, and then said he'd be in touch. He has not been in touch. That was 11 weeks ago. What I have now is this: a data set that 3 institutions are independently sitting on, a trench that the latest automated survey shows has expanded laterally by roughly 800 meters since September, and a sound file, the last transmission from the remotely operated vehicle that was sent down 2 months after our return, which lost signal at 900 meters. That is 11 seconds of the same pulse sequence Drummond identified as sequential, building towards something. Drummond left academia in October. He is working at a marine equipment company in San Diego. I called him once. He answered, and I said his name, and there was a pause, and he said evenly that he was glad I was doing okay, and I hadn't said anything about how I was doing. I told him about the ROV transmission. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Don't play it again." Just that. I asked him why. He said, "Because it's closer to the period now." Then he said he had to go and he hung up, and I have not called him again because I don't think he's wrong. I still have the printout with the coffee stain. I don't know why I kept it. I don't know why that's the thing I reach for when I'm trying to explain to someone what happened on the Ines Falk. But it is a water-ringed document showing a number that shouldn't exist, handed to me by a man who had forgotten he was holding a mug because something had already begun and none of us knew it yet. There is nothing cosmic about a coffee stain. That's exactly why I keep it. I took the Fresno job because I was 3 months behind on rent, and my cousin knew a labor contractor who didn't ask questions. I want to start there because I think it matters. The reason people end up on properties like Halverson's is never mysterious. It's always something ordinary. Rent, a truck payment, a family member who needed money sent home. The men I worked alongside that August had reasons just as plain as mine, and they had names, and I want to say some of those names before I say anything else, because the way this kind of story usually gets told, the men in the bunkhouse become atmosphere. They were not atmosphere. Fidel was 23 and sending half his check to his mother in Madeira. Rogelio had been doing harvest circuits for 11 years and knew every labor contractor from Bakersfield to Stockton and could tell you which ones paid on time. A man named Celestino, who had a photograph of his 2 daughters taped above his bunk, was on his 2nd season at Halverson's and had mentioned once that he was trying to save enough to open a small parts shop back home. I did not know any of this about them when I arrived. I learned it slowly, over meals and breaks, the way you learn things about people you live alongside. I am telling you now because of what I found out later about who was missing, and because missing people should be known as people before they are known as missing. The orchard was 400 acres of almonds outside Parlier, which is a small city southeast of Fresno that exists, as far as most of California is concerned, primarily as a dot between larger dots on the highway map. Halverson ran a clean operation on the surface, equipment maintained, pay delivered weekly in cash, bunkhouse functional, if not comfortable. There were 16 of us that season. I was new. So was Fidel, though he'd worked a season on this same property 3 years prior and had left early, for reasons he didn't volunteer and I didn't press. I noticed, in those first few days, that the returning workers had a particular quality of silence around them. Not unfriendly, just settled. Like men who had made some private arrangement with the place and were no longer in negotiation with it. The first thing I noticed that I could not explain was the sleeping. Everyone in the bunkhouse slept as though they had been switched off. Total. Immediate. Absolute. I sleep lightly by nature, and I lay awake the first several nights listening to the quality of it, which was different from the deep sleep of exhausted men. Exhausted men shift and snore and sometimes talk. These men were simply absent. I mentioned it to Fidel on day 4, and he looked at his coffee and said the work took it out of you. He didn't look at me when he said it. The 3rd night, the door woke me. I counted the empty beds, 14. I got up and followed. I lost them in the orchard rows within minutes. Dark, disorienting, the trees identical in every direction. I went east because that was the direction they'd been heading, and I found nothing except at the far edge of the property, a section of ground I hadn't seen during the workday. Flat, very dark soil, a circular depression at the center, IA pump housing running without any visible connection to an irrigation line. I stood at the edge of it. The pump made a low vibration that I felt through my boots and in my chest, not in any dramatic way, the way you feel a generator running in the next room. After a minute, I felt lightheaded and stepped back. I did not go closer. I went back to the bunkhouse. Everyone was in their beds. There was soil on the floor that hadn't been there at lights out. In the morning, I watched Celestino eat breakfast. He was talking about his daughters, about how the older one had started reading on her own, how he'd called home the previous Sunday, and she'd read him something from a book she'd chosen herself. He was smiling. He looked like a man who had his whole life accounted for and was simply working his way through a necessary portion of it. I thought about that expression on his face for a long time afterward. What I found in Halverson's office, and I want to be plain that I went in there deliberately on a day he was out on the equipment because the nightly departures had moved past the threshold of something I could attribute to heat or exhaustion, was an 11-year employment record with a column I had to read 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. 7 workers, across 6 different seasons, had a notation next to their name that said retained. No final paycheck, no separation paperwork, no forwarding address. Just that word, in Halverson's handwriting, with a date. The dates were all in the final weeks of harvest season. Whatever retained meant in Halverson's private accounting, it meant a person had come to the end of their usefulness as a free worker and had not left. I looked up the names when I got back to Fresno. This took me 3 weeks, and a lot of time in a public library using databases I didn't entirely know how to navigate. Of the 7 men, I found missing persons reports for 4 of them, filed by wives, by siblings, by a mother in Oaxaca who had reported her son missing to both Mexican consular services and Fresno County Sheriff, and had received, according to the case file I eventually obtained through a records request, 2 follow-up contacts over 3 years, and then silence. The 3 remaining men I could find almost nothing about, which is its own kind of information about who gets looked for and how hard and by whom. I reported what I'd found to Fresno County Sheriff in September. I gave them the names, the payroll records I had photographed on my phone, the specific dates, the location of the eastern field. The deputy who took my statement was professional and thorough and told me they would look into it. In November, I called to follow up and was told the investigation was ongoing and they couldn't share details. In February, I called again and was connected to a different deputy who had no record of my original statement and asked me to come in and start over. I did. I've called 4 more times since then. The investigation is, as far as I can tell, ongoing in the same way that a door is closed, present, solid, not moving. I called the mother in Oaxaca. I want to say this clearly because I almost didn't, because I didn't know what I would say, and I was afraid of making something worse. I found a contact number through the consular services report. She answered on the second ring. Her son's name was Aurelio. He had gone to California for a second harvest season in 2019 and had stopped calling home in October of that year. She had filed the missing persons report herself, in person, driving 4 hours to the nearest office that could receive it. She had not heard from Fresno County Sheriff in 14 months. When I told her what I had found in the employment records, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me if I thought her son was alive. I told her I didn't know. I told her I was sorry. She said she had known something was wrong in October 2019, because Aurelio had never once gone a week without calling. Not in 2 years of seasonal work, not once. She said the hardest part was not knowing whether to keep the phone number active in case he called. I have kept every document, every photograph, every call log. I have sent the full file to 2 investigative journalists, one labor rights organization based in Fresno, and a legal clinic at UC Davis that works on agricultural labor cases. One of the journalists wrote back. She said it was a credible account, and she was pursuing it alongside 2 other reports she'd received about properties in the same county with similar patterns. She said these cases were difficult because the workforce was largely undocumented, and because seasonal labor disappearances were under-resourced by every agency that should be tracking them. She said she was working on it. I believe her. I am still waiting. Halverson's property is still operating. I looked it up last month. The almonds are in season. There are workers on the property. I do not know their names yet. I think about the photograph above Celestino's bunk, his daughters, one of whom had just learned to read on her own. And I think about the gap between the horror of what I saw on that property and the much quieter, much more persistent horror of what happens when the right people are told and nothing moves. The field at night, the running pump, the soil, those things frightened me in August. What frightens me now is a case file marked ongoing and a woman in Oaxaca keeping her phone number active. That is not atmosphere. That is just what happened and what is still happening and what I could not stop. They saw his face in the char. That is where I have to start because everything else, the incident report, the recovery team, the 2 years of Tomas going back to that mountain alone, only makes sense if you understand that first. The survey team leader, a woman named Okafor, who had worked burn zone assessment for 11 years, took a photograph of the tree where they found him because she needed proof she hadn't imagined it. She showed me the photograph 5 weeks later in a coffee shop in La Cañada Flintridge, and I looked at it for a long time, and she watched me look at it, and neither of us said anything. It is a photograph of a burned tree. It is also, if you let your eyes follow the char lines to their conclusion, a photograph of Thomas's face, rendered in combustion, clear enough that Okafor had recognized him before she'd confirmed his identity through any other means. She said she'd stood very still for almost a minute after she took it. She said the expression on his face, in the char, was not afraid. Thomas and I had grown up 2 houses apart in Eagle Rock. We were not the kind of friends who talked every week, but the kind who could go 4 months without contact and pick up a conversation from wherever it had stopped, which is rarer and more valuable than the other kind. I knew he had survived the Ridgeline fire. I knew he had been one of 6 people on that trail and the only one who came down. I knew he didn't talk about it in any meaningful way. He talked about logistics, trail conditions, wind direction, and the way you describe a car accident when you've decided not to be the person the car accident happened to. What I did not know, until his sister Paloma told me 2 months after his body was recovered, was that he had been going back to the burn zone for nearly 2 years, 9 times, into the interior, past the closure signs, alone. Paloma is 4 years older than Thomas was, and she has his same quality of stillness, the same way of waiting until she is sure before she speaks. She sat across from me at her kitchen table in Silver Lake and told me about the visits without editorializing, just the facts of them. And then she gave me his notebook. He had kept records of every trip, dates, observations, hand-drawn maps of the interior with trees numbered and notated. The early entries read like ecology notes, regrowth assessment, ice soil conditions, the specific absence of birdsong. By the 6th month, the entries had changed. He had started cataloging the burn patterns on specific trees in a quarter-mile radius near the fire's origin point, and he had started cross-referencing those patterns to the 5 people who had died on the trail with him. He had matched postures, approximate heights, the particular forward tilt of his friend Garrett's head, which Garrett had carried since a neck injury in high school, visible in the char of tree number 4 with enough specificity that Thomas had written beneath the sketch, "This is not coincidence. This is Garrett. This is exactly how Garrett stood." I drove up to the Angeles National Forest on a Tuesday in November, because standing still felt worse than moving, and because I did not yet understand what moving toward that place would cost me. I parked at the trailhead, hiked past the closure signs, and followed the map Thomas had drawn in his notebook. The burn zone interior was silent in a way I had not prepared for. Not the silence of an empty place, but the silence of a place that has removed everything capable of making sound. No insects. No wind movement, because there was nothing to move. Just standing char in every direction and a gray sky and my boots on ground that had been reduced to something mineral and bare. I found the quarter-mile radius easily because Thomas had marked the boundary trees with orange surveyor's tape. 15 trees, each tagged with a number. I worked through them in order. 7 of them carried burn patterns that resolved at a certain angle in that flat November light into figures, upright, distinct, with the particular qualities of specific bodies rather than the random articulation of fire. I'm not a person who believes easily. I stood in front of each tree and I looked, and I tried to see randomness, and I could not always find it. Tree number 4, Garrett's tree, was the worst. The forward tilt of the head, the way the char thickened at the shoulders. I stood in front of it for 4 minutes, and then I heard something that stopped me entirely. It was behind me. Not a sound I can classify cleanly. Not an animal, not wind, not the structural settling of burned wood. A sound with rhythm and intention, like weight being shifted deliberately, or like something adjusting its position. I turned around. The tree line was still. I stood without moving for 30 seconds and heard nothing further, and then heard it again, from a different direction, further away this time, and then from a third direction that formed a triangle around me if I mapped the 3 points in my head, which I did involuntarily, and the mapping told me that whatever was making the sound was not in one place. I walked back toward the boundary tape at a pace I did not let become a run, because running felt like a declaration I wasn't ready to make. The sounds did not follow me past the boundary markers. I don't know what to do with that. I have thought about it many times, and I don't know what to do with it. What Paloma told me on my second visit, the one I made after the burn zone, and it was about a phone call she'd received 8 months before Thomas died. The caller was a woman named Renata, whose husband Marco had also survived the Ridgeline fire. Renata had called to ask if Paloma had noticed anything unusual about the burn zone boundary, specifically whether Paloma thought it was moving. Renata's husband Marco had been going back to the zone the same way Tomas had, and he had noticed the same thing Tomas had noticed. The closure signs repositioned, the boundary extended quietly and without announcement in the direction of the residential foothills. Marco had stopped going back after a specific visit, in the middle of which he had called Renata from the trailhead and told her they needed to leave Los Angeles. They had left within 3 weeks. When Paloma called Renata back after Thomas died, the number had been disconnected. I have tried to find Marco and Renata through 4 different avenues. I have found nothing, the kind of nothing that is different from someone simply being hard to find, the kind that suggests someone decided very deliberately not to be findable. The boundary has moved twice more since I went up in November. I know this because Okafor has been tracking it quietly, using the survey markers as reference points, without filing anything official because she has not figured out what she would file or to whom. She texts me the measurements. The most recent one added 340 meters in the direction of a neighborhood called Montrose. She sent it at 11 at night, with no comment. I looked at it and put my phone face down and lay in the dark for a while thinking about Thomas's notebook, specifically the last entry, written 6 days before they found him. They're on the eastern side now, started at the origin point and moved, followed today's survey markers, not going back without knowing why they move. He went back. He found out. Whatever he understood in those final 6 days, he understood it standing at tree number 7, or tree number 12, or somewhere between them in that silenced interior. And when Okafor's team reached him, he was against the tree, and his expression in the char, in the permanent record the fire made of his face, was not afraid. I've tried to decide how to feel about that, whether it is a comfort that he wasn't frightened at the end, or whether the absence of fear is itself the most frightening part, because fear would mean he was still operating as a person who understood the situation as a threat. The absence of fear means something else. It means he had reclassified. It means whatever the burn zone showed him in those last days, he stopped experiencing it as something happening to him and started experiencing it as something he was becoming part of. The boundary is still moving. Okafor tracks it and texts me numbers, and I write them down. Montrose is a neighborhood of houses and schools and a library that opens at 10 on weekday mornings. The people who live there do not know there is a measurement being taken in their direction, because why would they? I have the notebook and the photograph and a list of numbers, and I have been inside the boundary and heard something arrange itself around me in a triangle and walked out before I found out what the triangle was for. I think about that walk, the specific pace of it, and the decision not to run, and I think about Thomas who went back when he had said he wouldn't, and I think the difference between us might not be courage or intelligence or any quality I can claim credit for. I think it might just be that I had somewhere to be that afternoon. That is a thin margin. I'm aware of how thin it is every time Okafor's number comes in and the boundary has moved again, and I look at it and do not go back and do not entirely know how much longer not going back will remain a choice I am capable of making. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened at the Marquis Theater. I know who I am. I need you to know that I know that, because by the end of this, you might not believe me. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I want to say that carefully, because I've learned that stating your own name out loud, with intention, with certainty, is something most people never have to think about. I have to think about it now, every single day. I'm an actor. Was an actor. I don't know which tense fits anymore, and I want to say up front, I've thought about this a lot. I've thought about whether what I experienced was real, whether it was psychological, whether a mind under enough pressure can construct things that feel completely physical and completely true. I've looked into it. I've spoken to a therapist. I've read about dissociative episodes, about the way extreme stress can fracture a person's sense of identity in ways that feel indistinguishable from reality. I'm not dismissing those explanations. I'm telling you, I can't make them fit everything that happened. What I have is what I remember, and I'm going to give it to you exactly as I remember it. And I'm going to tell you when I'm certain and when I'm not. I moved to Los Angeles 7 years ago with a headshot and the specific kind of delusion that only works on people who've never been humiliated in front of a paying audience. I'd been humiliated plenty since. Small theaters, smaller checks, a commercial for a regional mattress chain that aired twice before they pulled it, because, according to the producer, I looked like someone who was pretending to be comfortable. That note stuck with me. I was always pretending. That was the job. So when the offer came, and I want to be very specific here, it came to me, I did not chase it. I assumed it was ordinary work. Understudy for a one-man show at the Marquis Theater on Cahuenga Boulevard, already running, critically received. The director, a man who introduced himself only as Hal, had reached out through a casting service called Meridian Talent, which I'd signed with 3 years prior and had essentially forgotten about. I didn't audition. I want you to sit with that. Though I'll also say this honestly, unusual casting calls happen in theater. Referrals happen. Directors sometimes fill understudy slots informally. I told myself it was one of those situations. I needed the work, and I was good at telling myself things that made it easier to take the work. And then the theater was a black box space, 90 seats, walls painted black, stage at floor level. The kind of room where intimacy isn't designed, it's imposed. I arrived on a Tuesday evening for the first rehearsal, and Hal met me in the green room. I was given a script and told to learn the role. He said I wouldn't need to perform it. He said just learn it. I asked what the show was about. He said, a man who doesn't know he's already dead. He left before I could ask anything else. Now here is the first place I want to be careful, because this is where my certainty starts to have edges. The script contained details that matched my life. Specific details. A faulty heating unit. A habit of eating the same meal 3 nights running. A photograph propped against a bathroom wall from a solo trip taken at 22. I had all of those things. I still have them. I do not know how to explain that. I've tried. The rational explanation is that a skilled playwright working from a composite of a certain type of person, a single man in his mid-30s, working actor, Los Angeles modest apartment, could land on those details coincidentally. It's possible. Urban loneliness has a specific texture, and a writer paying attention could reconstruct it without knowing me. I'm telling you what I felt when I read it, which was a cold that started at the back of my neck and moved forward. I'm not telling you it was supernatural. I'm telling you it felt wrong in a way I couldn't locate or dismiss. Then I met the other understudy. He was in the green room on the second evening, sitting in the corner, reading. He looked up when I came in, and there was a pause between us that I still can't describe without sounding like I'm being dramatic, so I'll just say it lasted longer than it should have. He introduced himself as Daniel Mercer. My name. I want to be precise here because I know how this sounds. He was not identical to me. He was similar. Same approximate build, same coloring, same general type. Enough that in a casting breakdown we would have been listed interchangeably. But he was not a mirror image, and he was not a hallucination. I can confirm he was physically present, because the stage manager, a woman named Petra, was in the room and acknowledged him. I spoke to Petra about this afterward. She confirmed she remembered him. She could not tell me his last name, or where he'd come from, or who had brought him in. She said she assumed he was with production. I asked him how long he'd been rehearsing the role. He said, longer than you'd think, and smiled in a way that was perfectly pleasant and completely wrong. I left early. I told myself it was nothing. 2 men with the same name. It happens. I was building a structure out of coincidences and calling it a house. The lead actor spoke to me only once. I'm going to tell you what he said, and I'm going to resist the urge to editorialize it because his words don't need my commentary. They've been doing fine on their own inside my head for the past 8 months. We passed in the corridor outside the dressing rooms 3 days before opening night. He stopped. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I would describe as exhausted grief, the kind that's been worn smooth by repetition. He said, learn nothing from this script. Understand nothing from it. You're not here to replace me. You're here to be replaced. I thought he was being theatrical. Actors are theatrical. I smiled and nodded and walked past him. I did not ask what he meant. I have thought about that moment every day since. Opening night. He didn't show, no call, no message through the director. The stage manager, Petra, came to my dressing room 40 minutes before curtain and said the lead was unavailable and I was going on. I later confirmed, and this is documented, there is a police report filed by the theater's production manager, a report I have physically seen, that the lead actor was reported missing that evening. He has not been located as of the time I'm recording this. I want to be clear that I'm not treating his disappearance as a plot point. A man is missing. Whatever happened to me that night, whatever I experienced, that is the real and serious center of this story. A man is missing, and I don't know where he is, and I think about that separately from everything else. I went on stage, and I performed every line. I want to be careful here too, because this is the part that sounds the most impossible. I had rehearsed for less than 2 weeks. A 90-minute solo monologue is not something you absorb in 2 weeks. And yet, I performed it without a single error. Every pause in the right place, every breath, every movement. The stage manager told me afterward she'd never seen anything like it. An audience member who came backstage said it was the most unsettling performance she'd ever witnessed, and she meant that as a compliment. I don't remember performing it. I remember walking to the center of the stage. I remember the lights. I remember nothing in between those two things, and then I remember the curtain coming down and the sound of applause, and standing there feeling nothing, which is the worst thing an actor can feel, because nothing means you weren't performing. Nothing means you were just being. Backstage after the curtain, someone approached me in the corridor. He looked like me, or he looked like a version of me. Younger, less settled, uncertain in a specific way I recognized as my own uncertainty from years ago. He seemed confused. He looked at me the way you look at a room you've walked into and can't remember why. He said, "I think I have your audition slot tomorrow. Now, I want to stop here and say what the responsible thing to say is." Whereas the responsible thing is, I may have been in a dissociative state following a high-stress performance. I may have encountered a young actor who resembled me the way many actors in this city resemble each other, and my mind, already primed by weeks of a script that felt too personal, may have constructed a significance that wasn't there. That is a real possibility. That is the possibility my therapist and I return to regularly. Capgras syndrome, dissociative fugue, stress-induced perceptual distortion. These are real documented phenomena, and I am not ruling any of them out. What I can tell you is what I experienced in that moment, flagged clearly as my subjective experience and not as confirmed physical fact. I walked to the dressing room mirror. I raised my hand. There was a delay, not a long one, not a cinematic, dramatic delay, a small one, the kind that makes you question your own eyes before your eyes finish sending the signal. Half a second, maybe less, maybe more. I stared at it for what felt like a long time. I left the theater. I've not been back. I've been told the show continued running for 3 weeks after opening night before the theater quietly closed it. I've been told how the director cannot be located through Meridian Talent, which, when I called them, had no record of a director by that name, or of placing me with the Marquee Theater. I have the email they sent me. I have the contract I signed. Meridian Talent says they didn't send it. I don't know what that means. I know who I am. I need you to know that I know that. The letter said I'd been keeping my neighbors up since October. I work nights. I haven't been home at 3 a.m. in 2 years. So either someone is in my apartment while I'm gone, or they're underneath it. My name is Sandra Reeves. I'm a registered nurse, night shift, Highland Hospital, East Oakland. I've worked nights for 6 years because the differential pay is better, and because, if I'm being honest, I've always been more comfortable when the rest of the world is asleep. Less noise, less performance. You're allowed to just exist at 3 a.m. in a way that daytime doesn't permit. I want to establish something about who I am before I tell you what happened. Because the kind of person you are matters when you're asking people to believe something unusual. I am not someone who looks for strangeness. I am not someone who has ever described herself as sensitive or intuitive or in tune with things beyond the normal. I'm someone who checks vitals, administers medications on a precise schedule, and documents everything. I am, by both training and temperament, a person who requires evidence before she forms a conclusion. I want you to hold on to that, because I held on to it myself all the way through this, and it is the only reason I trust what I eventually found. I've lived in the same apartment building in East Oakland for 4 years, 4th floor, Unit 412. It's a 1960s complex, exterior corridors, the kind of building where you can hear your neighbors through the walls if they're having a bad night, which in this neighborhood is not infrequent. I made peace with that a long time ago. You learn to filter. You learn which sounds mean something and which sounds are just the building settling into itself the way old buildings do. The letter from management arrived on a Thursday in late November. I remember because I'd just come off a double shift, and I was standing at my mailbox in my scrubs at 7 in the morning with the particular hollowness that follows 14 hours of other people's emergencies. The letter said that building management had received multiple noise complaints referencing Unit 412, sounds consistent with furniture moving and heavy footsteps, occurring between 3 and 4 a.m. The complaints had been logged for 6 consecutive weeks beginning in October. Management requested that I be mindful of noise levels during late-night hours. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time because I wanted to make sure I hadn't misunderstood something. I work 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 4 nights a week. I have not been in my apartment at 3 a.m. since I took this shift 6 years ago. I have a timesheet, a badge log, security camera footage at the hospital entrance, and the personal recollection of every colleague I work alongside. I am not home at 3 a.m. I am categorically, documentably not home at 3 a.m. I went upstairs. I checked the apartment. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. The locks were intact. The windows were locked from the inside, and there was no sign that anyone had entered. I called management and explained that I worked nights and asked who had made the complaints. They said they couldn't disclose that. I asked if anyone had physically investigated the source of the sounds. And there was a pause. They said they had forwarded the complaints to me as a courtesy. I want to pause here and tell you what the rational explanations were, because I ran through all of them. Someone was entering my apartment. The sounds were from another unit and had been misattributed. The building's acoustics were distorting sounds from elsewhere in the structure. All of those were more likely than what I eventually found. I want you to know I started there. I want you to know I tried to stay there. I set up my phone on a kitchen shelf before my next shift. Charged, propped against a jar, angled to cover most of the apartment. I enabled audio recording and left. I reviewed the footage the next morning. My apartment was silent for the entire 7 hours. Nothing moved, no entry, no disturbance. Not even the ambient settling sounds I'd expected. 11 hours of still, dark, empty rooms. But the audio picked up footsteps beginning at 3:09 a.m. and ending at 3:58 a.m. Clear, rhythmic, unhurried footsteps. The sound of something heavy being dragged briefly around the 3:30 mark. And once, at 3:47, the definitive, unmistakable sound of a door closing. Not in my apartment. The acoustics were wrong for that. The sounds had the quality of something heard through a floor, transmitted upward. They were coming from below me. The 3rd floor of my building has been under renovation for 11 months. No tenants. The windows on that corridor are covered with plywood. There's a padlock on the stairwell door at the 3rd floor landing. The building's renovation schedule, which management posts in the lobby, and has listed the 3rd floor as inactive since January. I had walked past that stairwell door hundreds of times. I had never thought about it. I went to management the following day. I told them what my recording had captured. I told them the sounds were not from my unit. I asked for access to the 3rd floor. The property manager, a man named Gerald, who has worked in that building longer than I've lived there, looked at me for a moment with an expression I want to describe accurately. It was not skepticism. It was something more, like reluctance. Like a man being asked to open a door he'd been quietly glad was closed. He gave me the key. I went up alone. I want to say I went up with someone, but I didn't, and I'm not going to adjust that detail to make myself seem more cautious. I went alone because I am a person who, and when confronted with a problem, goes toward it. 6 years of night shifts teaches you that. The 3rd floor corridor smelled like plaster dust and old wood. The work lights were not connected. I used my phone flashlight. The unit I needed was 312, directly below my own. The padlock came off. The door opened. The renovation was untouched in the way that long-paused projects are untouched. Not clean, not maintained, just stopped. Covered furniture pushed against walls. Bare floors in the areas where old carpet had been pulled up. A layer of fine construction dust over every surface, undisturbed. It had the quality of a room that had been sealed rather than abandoned. There is a difference, I think, between a place that has been left and a place that has been closed. And then I saw the floor, through the center of the room, and from the window to the door to the kitchen entry and back, there was a path. Not marked, not made by any visible tool, just worn. The dust on either side of it was thick and even. The path itself was clean, not as if it had been swept, as if it had been walked, as if something had passed over it so many times that the dust had simply given up settling there. The path was narrow, the width of a person walking slowly. I stood in that room for a long time without moving. The nurse part of my brain was already doing something the rest of me hadn't caught up to yet. It was measuring, calculating. The path went from the window, where you could see the street, to the front door, where you would hear someone coming, to the kitchen, where the phone would have been, in a 1960s unit, wall-mounted by the counter. 3 points. The same 3 points over and over, worn into the dust like a groove into wood. I went back to management. I asked about the unit's history. Gerald looked at me with that same reluctant expression and pulled a folder without me having to explain why I was asking. The last tenant of Unit 312 was a man named Ernest Howell. He had lived there for 19 years. He was 74 years old. He had died in that apartment 11 months ago, in January, and had not been found for approximately 3 weeks. The discovery had been made by a maintenance worker responding to a report about a water leak in the unit below. There was no family listed in the file, no emergency contact. The coroner's report noted natural causes. The file noted, in Gerald's handwriting, in the margin, no next of kin. No one came. I read that last line several times. No one came. I thought about what the path meant, what it looked like when you mapped it onto a life rather than a floor plan. The window where you could watch the street and see if someone was coming. The door where you could listen for footsteps in the corridor. The kitchen where the phone was. The phone you might have tried. The phone that either wasn't answered or wasn't called because you had no one to call. 3 weeks. Alone in that room. Waiting. Maybe not consciously. Maybe just in the way that a body continues to hope, even when the mind has stopped asking for someone to come through that door. And then someone had. Eventually. But not in time. And then the door had been padlocked, and the windows had been boarded, and the renovation had stalled, and 11 months had passed. And the path in the dust said that something in that room had not understood yet that the waiting was over. I am a nurse. I believe in the physical. I believe in what can be measured and documented and repeated. I do not know how to explain what I understood in that moment, and I am not going to dress it up as certainty. What I can tell you is what I did. I went back to the 3rd floor that evening. I let myself in. I stood in the center of the room, and I spoke out loud into the dark, which is not something I have ever done before, and which I am aware sounds, depending on who you are, either meaningful or absurd. I told him he had been found. I told him that someone had come. I told him his name because I felt, and I'm giving you my subjective experience here, and he clearly flagged as that. I felt that a man who had died alone without anyone using his name deserved to have it spoken in the room where he had waited. Ernest Howell. I said it clearly. Ernest Howell, you were found. The footsteps stopped that night. I know because I recorded again. 11 hours of audio. Silence. The following night, silence. The following week, silence. I have 17 recordings taken across the past 3 weeks. All silent. Management closed the noise complaint file 10 days ago. Cause listed, unresolved. I've thought a lot about what responsible conclusions to draw from this. I've thought about infrasound, about how low-frequency vibrations in old buildings can create auditory illusions. I've thought about the way dust settles and whether foot traffic from adjacent spaces could have created that pattern over time. I've thought about whether I was in a dissociative state when I saw the path and am now retrofitting meaning onto a physical coincidence. These are all legitimate questions, and I don't have definitive answers to any of them. What I have is this. A man named Ernest Howell lived alone for 19 years in a building I've lived in for 4. He died alone. He waited 3 weeks to be found, and when I said his name in that room and told him someone had come, something that had been happening every night for 11 months stopped. I'm a nurse. I document what I observe, and I flag what I can't explain. Ernest Howell, Unit 312, found. I just wanted someone to know that. The valley wasn't on the satellite image taken Monday. It was on the one taken Tuesday. Priya Menon drove out Wednesday morning to log the discrepancy. A standard preliminary check, the kind she'd done hundreds of times, the kind that usually takes 4 hours and generates half a page of field notes. She came back Friday. She didn't tell anyone what she'd found, not because she'd been instructed to stay quiet, but because 11 years of surveying had given her a precise professional vocabulary, and none of it had a word for a place that shouldn't exist deciding on a Tuesday to exist. Priya worked out of the BLM field office in 29 Palms. 11 years. The Eastern Mojave was her territory in the specific way that a place becomes yours, not through ownership, but through accumulation. Every arroyo she'd measured, every ridge she'd walked, every coordinate she'd ground truthed, until the land and the map of the land felt like the same thing. That convergence, map and terrain becoming identical, was the whole point of the job. Discrepancies were supposed to be administrative. A labeling error. A processing artifact in the aerial data. They were not supposed to be valleys. She almost didn't flag it. The shadow in Tuesday's imagery was subtle. A tonal shift in the terrain east of the Cadiz corridor that could have been a sensor calibration issue, could have been cloud interference, could have been nothing. She'd seen the 1987 survey of that grid, the 1999 update, the 2011 comprehensive, solid ridge, continuous formation, no pass, no depression, no anomaly, are 3 separate surveys by 3 different teams across 24 years, and not one of them had noted anything. She flagged it because that was the protocol, and she followed protocol, and because something in the shadow's geometry bothered her in a way she couldn't locate precisely, the way a wrong measurement bothers you before you've identified which number is off. The dirt track out to the ridge wasn't on her GPS. That happened sometimes in the Mojave. Old mining roads, ranch access tracks, nothing official. She followed the terrain eastward and parked where the track ended at the base of the ridge, and that's when she saw the canyon, 12 feet wide, paved, white lane markings, fresh enough that she crouched down and pressed her thumb to one, and it left a faint impression. A paved road with fresh paint leading through a canyon that 3 surveys over 24 years had missed. She photographed it. She noted the time, 10:14 a.m. She drove through. The valley stopped her in a way she wasn't prepared for, and she wants to be honest about that moment because she thinks the honesty matters. It wasn't fear, not immediately. It was the geometry. The ridge formed a circle. Not approximately circular the way some valley formations trend, but a circle in the way. A drawn circle is a circle, the kind of precision that belongs to instruments and intentions, not erosion. 3 miles across. She sat in her truck at the canyon exit and looked at it and felt her surveyor's brain trying to process the shape and producing, instead of data, a blank. The town inside the circle had roads. A grid, which meant planning. which meant someone had stood in this valley with stakes and string and decided where the streets would go. The concrete foundations were poured, not stacked. Modern mix, aggregate ratio consistent with post-1970s commercial construction. Streetlights every 40 meters. The fixtures, a municipal model she'd seen in Palmdale and Victorville, discontinued around 2003. Some foundations had partial walls. Some had rebar curling up from broken edges like fingers. Everything was the right age to have been built in the late 70s or early 80s and abandoned shortly after, except that no record acknowledged it had been built at all. She found a smell she wasn't expecting. That's the detail she keeps coming back to, the one that didn't make it into the official report because she didn't know how to file it. Hot concrete, and something underneath it, something older, like the specific dry rod of paper that's been sealed in a warm space for decades. She followed it to the largest standing structure near the grid's center and found the source on the back wall. 19 survey maps. She counted them twice. Different papers, different print technologies. The oldest on linen-backed drafting paper, the kind that went out of standard use in the early 90s. The newest on the same laser print stock her own office used. 4 decades of cartographic practice, 4 decades of different hands, and every single one of them mapping this valley. The same valley. The foundations in the same positions, the roads on the same grid, the ridge perimeter measured and noted in different styles, but landing on the same numbers. She read the margins the way you read the margins of any field document looking for notation. Compass corrections, datum references, the small professional shorthand that surveyors use to communicate with whoever picks up the document next. Every map had the same 7 words. Different handwriting, different ink color. One in pencil so faint, she had to angle her flashlight parallel to the page to read the impression. The same 7 words on 19 separate documents spanning 40 years. No exit found on day 3. She put the maps down. She stood in that room and looked at her own hands for a moment. The specific grounding technique she'd developed over years of solo fieldwork when the Mojave's scale threatened to make her feel very small. Her hands, her equipment, the coordinates she'd verified. These things were true and present. She filed that fact and went back to work. She camped in her truck that night, sent her position via satellite communicator, logged a preliminary discovery report, noted the survey maps, noted the construction evidence, requested follow-up resources. Got no response, which happened sometimes with the satellite relay out of 29 Palms when the overnight tech was behind on the queue. She set her alarm for 5 a.m. and slept in the way you sleep when your body's tired, but some other part of you has decided to stay awake and keep watch. She measured the canyon pass at 5:17 a.m. before she'd had coffee, before she'd done anything else, because the margin notation was sitting in the back of her skull and she wanted a number to put against it. 9 feet, 4 inches. She measured it twice. She documented 12 feet, 1 inch on entry. She stood in the narrowed passage with her field tape and the desert light coming gray and flat through the gap and did the arithmetic she didn't want to do. 2 feet, 9 inches in approximately 19 hours. If the rate held, by the end of day 2 the pass would be under 7 feet. By the end of day 3 it would be... She didn't finish the calculation. She drove back into the valley. She found the camp by smell before she found it by sight. Coffee, actual brewed coffee, which was such a specific and unexpected human smell in that place that she nearly stopped the truck when it came through the window. 3 tents against the eastern ridge, a fire ring, a folding table with maps weighted down at the corners with field equipment she recognized, the same brands her office stocked, the same worn nylon cases. 3 people. She wants to describe them accurately. They were thin in the way people get thin when they're rationing, not starving, but managing. Their field gear was clean and maintained, which told her something about who they were. People who took care of their equipment were people who were still functioning, still applying professional discipline to their situation. They looked at her truck coming across the grid, and they stopped what they were doing, and they watched her park, and the expression on the nearest one's face. She's tried to describe this and keeps landing on the same inadequate place. It was the look of a person who had been waiting for something for so long that the arrival of it didn't produce relief so much as a complicated tiredness. The Barstow surveyor had been there 4 years. He said it without drama. And the way you say, a fact you've made peace with. The Riverside surveyor, 3 years. The woman from Palm Springs, 14 months. All dispatched on preliminary checks. All entered through the canyon on a Wednesday, all alone. Priya asked the Barstow surveyor to tell her about day 3. She asked directly because she didn't want the information managed for her emotional comfort. He told her the pass continued to narrow overnight. By the morning of day 3, it was passable on foot, barely. By the afternoon, it was the width of a turn sideways. By evening, it was a gap you could see light through, but nothing else. He said he'd stood at it on day 4 with his palm flat against the rock on either side and looked through at the desert and felt, and this is where his voice changed register slightly, where the managed flatness shifted, felt that going through was not something the place was going to allow. Not a physical barrier, something else, something he'd spent 3 years trying to find a professional vocabulary for and hadn't. He said the valley kept growing. New foundations at the edges of the grid, appearing between one survey day and the next. New road extending the pattern outward. They mapped because it was the only structured use of time available, and because surveyors map, and because stopping felt like a different kind of surrender than the one they'd already made. She asked about the satellite communicators. He said outgoing messages sent, no responses received, ever, in 4 years. She left at 4:50 a.m. on day 3. She'd been awake since 2. She drove to the pass in the dark and measured it by headlight. 7 feet, 2 inches. She had 8 inches of clearance on the driver's side and 6 on the passengers. She put the truck in drive and went through without stopping, without slowing, without looking at the rock on either side because she'd decided that looking was a way of hesitating. And hesitating was the one thing she couldn't afford. She came out the other side, onto the dirt track and drove for 10 minutes before she stopped. The specific things she noticed when she stopped. Her hands on the steering wheel were shaking, but her breathing was controlled, and she understood from that gap between her hands and her lungs that her body had been more frightened than she'd let herself know. She filed a full report. Names of the 3 surveyors, field offices, dispatch dates, last known coordinates inside the valley, construction evidence, survey maps, canyon measurements across 2 days, the margin notation transcribed exactly from all 19 documents. She used the word anomalous 11 times and the word unexplained twice, and she did not use the words that were actually accurate because there were no forms for them. A recovery team was dispatched. She was not included in the operation. 6 weeks later, a colleague in the Barstow office mentioned, without context or elaboration, that a surveyor missing for 4 years had come back. He said it the way you say something you've been instructed not to elaborate on. She didn't ask for more. 3 months after her report, a new preliminary check was dispatched to the same coordinates. She saw the dispatch in the field office queue. Different surveyor. Alone. Wednesday departure. She almost said something. She stood in the doorway of the dispatch office and looked at the assignment sheet and thought about what she would say, how she would phrase it, what professional language existed for what she needed to communicate. She checked the surveyor's kit instead, made sure the field tape was accurate, made sure there were enough supplies for 3 days, made sure the satellite communicator had fresh batteries. The surveyor asked her why she was checking his kit personally. She said, measure the canyon on the way in. Write the number down. Measure it every morning first thing. If the number changes, leave that day. Don't wait to understand why. Don't finish the survey. Leave that day. He looked at her the way people look at advice they don't yet have the context to evaluate. She hoped he'd remember it on Wednesday morning. She hoped he'd remember it before day 3. That's the only thing she hopes now. Just that he writes the number down. Just that he leaves before day 3. Hey, if you made it this far, you already know what kind of channel this is. Let's Fear doesn't do jump scares or cheap thrills. We find the stories that feel too specific, too documented, too quietly wrong to dismiss, and we sit with them. If that's what you're here for, subscribe, turn on notifications, and next time you drive somewhere new, measure the exit on the way in, just to have the number, just in case. We'll see you in the next one.